A single stream of sunlight broke through the half-drawn curtain, illuminating the dust motes floating in the still morning air. Mara sat at the edge of her bed, eyes fixed on the swirling flecks, as though they might offer some revelation about what she had done. She could still feel the weight of Dominic's presence, the faint memory of his scent mixing with her own in the sheets. Guilt gnawed at the pit of her stomach, but so did a sense of longing that she couldn't deny. She blinked, trying to clear her mind. In a few minutes, she had to rise and play the part of the devoted wife, pretend that nothing had changed. Yet everything had changed. For 10 years, Mara had been married to Jacob. They lived in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Redwood Heights, a place that prided itself on friendly neighbors, well-kept lawns, and streets named after trees that lined each side of the community. Jacob was a kind man, stable in his ways, a mathematics teacher at the local high school who found genuine joy in Sunday crosswords and tidy weekly lesson plans. He had a calming presence that filled their home. Indeed, Mara had always admired his consistency and his sense of responsibility. She, on the other hand, was a magazine editor who had once dreamed of writing novels. She worked long hours editing articles about travel and leisure, all the while fantasizing about places she had never actually visited. A part of her felt restless. She tried to quash that feeling of yearning for something more, something thrilling, something that would make her heart race. But each day bled into the next with numbing predictability. Breakfast at 7, a quick commute, 8 hours of editing copy, a polite wave to her coworker Dominic across the aisle, dinner at 6 with Jacob, an hour of television, bed at 10. She told herself that a stable life was a blessing. She had grown up in a chaotic household, raised by a single mother who often struggled to pay the bills. Mara recalled nights spent huddled under blankets lit by a flickering lamp, hearing her mother cry softly in the other room. She had craved stability all her childhood, yearned for a life without fear. Now that she had it, she thought she should be satisfied. But some nights, she stared at the ceiling fan swirling overhead, listening to Jacob's soft breathing, and wondered if this safe harbor had also become her prison. The spark came unexpectedly, as such things often do. It began with casual small talk at the water cooler. Dominic, a fellow editor, was reviewing a piece about an exotic Caribbean resort, glancing at photographs of white sand beaches and turquoise waters. Mara reached for a paper cup, and he asked her opinion on which photo to select for the magazine cover. She angled her head to study the vibrant shots of swaying palm trees, the sun's rays glinting off the ocean surface, and gave him her professional insight. Their conversation was friendly, nothing out of the ordinary. Yet a week later, Dominic slipped a short story manuscript onto her desk, typed up in neat lines, inviting her to offer her editorial feedback. "I know you're an editor here, but this is more personal," he said quietly, with just a hint of a smile. "I'd really appreciate your thoughts." She took the manuscript home that evening. Jacob was grading math tests in the living room, and the rhythmic scratching of his pen usually helped Mara focus. She curled up in a corner of the sofa, reading Dominic's story about a young journalist traveling alone through the coast of Italy, finding hidden villages and forging unexpected connections. As she read, she discovered not only a well-crafted tale, but an undercurrent of longing. It mirrored the flickers of restlessness she sometimes felt but could not articulate. By the time she finished, she was struck by how Dominic had captured, in words, that sense of being half in love with possibility. The next day, she found herself in front of Dominic's desk, praising his imagery, his pacing, the careful character arcs. He listened intently, leaning forward. There was a new electricity in the space between them. When she finished giving her feedback, he smiled in a soft, self-conscious way. "I've always wanted to be a writer," he said. "Hearing that from you means more than you can imagine." They began sharing snippets of conversation, more about writing, dreams, places they hoped to travel. Their glances grew lingered. Mara noticed the way Dominic's eyes seemed to glow when he talked about his inspirations. He noticed the way her lips curled when she described the parts of a story she loved most. And neither said anything about the line they were starting to cross. It was nearly 2 months after that first manuscript exchange when Dominic invited Mara to a small literary gathering at a local cafe. "It's just a little open mic night for aspiring writers," he explained, half smiling. "It might be fun to see what people are reading." Mara's heart fluttered at the invitation. She reasoned it was innocent enough, just a professional event, right? Jacob had a staff meeting at the school that same evening, so Mara made excuses. "It's work-related. I might be home late." Her husband nodded, oblivious to any hint of concern. They had built up a secure trust over the years, one that Mara had never even considered betraying until now. The cafe, called Twilight Pages, was a dimly lit nook lined with wooden bookshelves. The air smelled of espresso beans and old paper. Poets, novelists, and curious guests milled about, sipping coffees and reading from typewritten pages. In that warm hum of conversation, Mara felt a spark of excitement, reminiscent of her younger, more hopeful self. She and Dominic sat at a small round table, listening to people recite verses about love, loss, and growth. At one point in the evening, Dominic leaned over. "You look beautiful tonight," he whispered. It was the first time he had made a personal remark. Mara's breath caught in her throat. Heat rose to her cheeks. She mumbled a flustered thank you, but the compliment had already landed, sending her heart racing. She was keenly aware of the ring on her left hand, a tangible reminder of the life she shared with Jacob. But that night, with the hush of literary voices around them, she found herself leaning closer to Dominic. When he placed a warm hand on hers beneath the table, she did not move away. Mara spent that night awake, staring at the ceiling in guilt-laced wonder. She could still feel the soft press of Dominic's fingers against her own. Jacob lay beside her, ignorant of the storm that was gathering inside her. She wondered how it was even possible to feel affection, and maybe even love, for two people at once. Jacob was comfort, Dominic was excitement. The idea haunted her. Was it so wrong to want more than one dimension of life? The next morning, she avoided Dominic as much as she could at work. She buried herself in tasks, hyper-focused on editing articles and sending emails. But mid-afternoon, she found a note slid under a file on her desk. "I know we didn't talk today. I just hope you're okay. I really enjoyed last night. Dominic." Her stomach flipped. She slipped the note into her purse and felt unsettled the entire drive home. That evening, she moved through her usual routine with Jacob, cooking dinner, chatting about his day. She could hear his gentle laughter over the sound of sizzling onions and the hum of the dishwasher. Guilt weighed on her, but so did the memory of Dominic's earnest eyes. In a moment of weakness, she found herself mentally comparing Jacob's steady sweetness to Dominic's spontaneous warmth. She hated herself for it, but couldn't stop. Days slid into weeks. The two illusions, her stable home life with Jacob and her simmering connection with Dominic, existed in parallel, never colliding. Mara convinced herself it was a harmless friendship with a touch of infatuation. They texted throughout the day, occasionally exchanged short stories for critique, or met for coffee to discuss new editorial policies. Each time, though, their smiles lingered a second too long. Their words danced around an unspoken attraction. One Friday night, after an exhausting day at the office, Mara discovered that Jacob had decided to go on a weekend camping trip with some of his fellow teachers. He asked if she wanted to join, but she feigned a headache and deadlines. Jacob kissed her forehead, told her to rest and not to worry. When he was gone, the house felt hollow. Mara wandered from room to room. She poured herself a glass of wine, sat on the couch, picked up her phone, and stared at Dominic's contact name. It was nearly 9 in the evening. Her heart thumped as she sent him a text. "Jacob's out of town tonight. Doing anything interesting?" His reply came quickly. "Not really. Want some company?" Mara hesitated, but the longing to see him was stronger than her guilt. She found herself typing, "Sure. Stop by." Dominic arrived a half hour later, a bottle of red wine in hand. They chatted in the living room, the light of a single lamp illuminating their faces. The conversation began innocently, banter about their coworkers, jokes about magazine deadlines, but soon turned personal. Mara found herself confessing small secrets. Her fear that she was no longer creative enough. Her frustration that life had become so routine. Dominic listened, nodding, his brown eyes intent on her every word. Then there was a pause. In that silence, the truth of why he was here settled between them. Mara watched him trace the rim of his glass with a fingertip, an expression on his face that mirrored her own mixture of hesitation and desire. "I don't want to hurt you," he said quietly, as though reading her mind. "Or myself. Or anyone else." Mara lowered her gaze, voice trembling. "Me neither. But I can't pretend that I don't feel something for you." The air felt thick, heavy with consequence. She glanced at her ring again, a wave of guilt threatening to drown her. But Dominic brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch tender, as though asking for permission. Slowly, without a word, she leaned closer. Their lips met, tentative at first, but swiftly igniting into a deep, urgent kiss. For one fleeting moment, time stood still, and Mara surrendered to the feeling of being truly, recklessly alive. They spent the night together in the hush of her bedroom, exploring the contours of each other's bodies and thoughts. Afterward, they lay tangled in sheets, hearts pounding, the reality of what they had just done slowly sinking in. When morning light filtered through the curtains, Mara felt both a rush of warmth and a stab of self-reproach. She remembered the promises she had made to Jacob. She remembered the vows. Yet here she was, in the arms of another man. Over the following weeks, Mara's life blurred into two distinct worlds. By day, she was the capable magazine editor and the devoted wife who woke up beside Jacob, cooked them both breakfast, asked about his next batch of student exams. By night, or at stolen moments in the office, she was Dominic's secret lover, stealing heated embraces in the supply room, lingering kisses in the back seat of his car during lunch breaks. Jacob noticed that she was more distant than usual, but he attributed it to stress at work. He took on extra chores, tried to plan small surprises to cheer her up. Each kindly act turned the knife of Mara's guilt a little deeper. She tried to compensate by being especially attentive to Jacob in the evenings, but every time she hugged him, she couldn't help but remember how she had touched Dominic just hours before. Dominic, for his part, struggled as well. He would show up at her desk with dark circles under his eyes, mention how he barely slept because he wrestled with the knowledge that Mara was not truly his. Their relationship had no clear path forward, no public future. And yet, when he looked at her, the attraction was undeniable. They were caught in a cycle of wanting what they shouldn't want and refusing to let it go. The unraveling began on an ordinary Tuesday night. Jacob was washing dishes, and Mara's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. She was out of the room, changing into more comfortable clothes. Jacob dried his hands and glanced at the screen. A text from Dominic glowed in bright letters. "I miss you. Can't stop thinking about last night. Hope you're sleeping well, beautiful." Jacob felt a sting in his chest. He had known Dominic only as a coworker of Mara's, someone from the magazine. Something about the text, its familiar tone, the hint of intimacy, turned Jacob's stomach. Carefully, he put the phone back on the counter, face down, dread blooming in his mind. When Mara came back, she sensed Jacob's demeanor had changed. The next few hours passed in an awkward tension. They watched TV in uncomfortable silence, neither speaking about the wedge that had so suddenly appeared. When they went to bed, Jacob feigned exhaustion, turning off the bedside lamp without a word. Mara curled up, trying to ignore the cold distance she felt radiating from him. But she couldn't sleep. Guilt churned in her gut, and her mind played out worst-case scenarios. She realized with a cold sweat that she had never put a lock on her phone. Or, if she had, maybe Jacob had guessed her passcode. Anxiety gnawed at her. The next morning over breakfast, Jacob confronted her. His voice trembled. "Who is Dominic to you?" Mara's heart leaped into her throat. She set down her coffee cup, sloshing some of it over the rim. For a moment, she considered lying, insisting it was a misunderstanding. But the hurt in Jacob's eyes cut right through her. She exhaled. "He's a friend. she stammered at first, but her voice cracked under the weight of deception. No, that's not. He's more than that. Jacob looked like he might break. His mouth opened and closed, forming no words, just a wounded silence. Finally, he pushed back his chair and stood, tears shining in his eyes. "Why didn't you talk to me?" he managed. "Why him?" Mara had no answers. She could only mumble fragmented apologies and tears. She tried to explain how trapped she'd felt, how she'd wanted some spark. None of it mattered. Jacob was trembling with betrayal, so blindsided he could hardly breathe. After 10 years of marriage, their foundation felt as if it were built on sand. Jacob left the house shortly after, murmuring something about needing space and time to think. Mara slumped onto the couch, surrounded by the echoing quiet. She wanted to chase him, to apologize more, to beg forgiveness, but some voice in her head told her that he needed to be alone. She closed her eyes, tears burning her cheeks, remembering the moment she'd first married him, the vows they'd exchanged, the promise to be there for each other in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer. She thought of Dominic and felt a confusing mix of remorse and longing. She texted Dominic. Jacob found out. "I told him. I don't know what happens now." Dominic called immediately, voice tight with worry. "Do you want me to come over?" "No," she said, her tone hollow. "I think I should be alone right now. I just wanted you to know. I don't know what to do." He exhaled, an entire storm of emotion vibrating through the phone line. "I'm here for you, whatever that means. Just promise me you'll be okay." Mara couldn't promise anything. She ended the call, letting the phone slip to the floor. She could still see the dinner table where she and Jacob had shared countless meals, the images of happier days swirling in her mind. Everything felt like it was spiraling out of control. For 3 days, Jacob didn't come home. Mara called him repeatedly, left messages. No response. She emailed her boss, taking an emergency leave of absence. She ignored Dominic's messages. Each morning, she woke in the empty bed, feeling the yawning chasm of her mistakes. She felt physically sick, barely able to keep food down. On the 4th day, the front door opened around lunchtime. Jacob stood there, eyes bloodshot, suitcase in hand. He had been staying with a fellow teacher, apparently. Mara rushed to him, tears choking her words. "I'm so sorry, Jacob, He held up a hand, voice hoarse with sleepless nights and heartbreak. "I need to talk, but I also need you to listen. Please, Mara." She fell silent. They sat on the couch, the same one she had shared with Dominic that fateful night. Mara's stomach twisted at the thought. Jacob's voice was low measured, as though he had rehearsed this conversation several times. "I can't pretend everything is normal. I feel like my heart has been ripped out. I keep asking myself if I was not enough, if I did something wrong, or if you just needed something else." Mara sniffled, wiping tears. "You were never not enough. You've been everything good in my life, Jacob. I don't have a good excuse. I felt stuck, and something about Dominic reminded me of this old spark I used to have." She paused, voice quivering. "That's not a justification. It's just the truth." He was quiet for a long time. The refrigerator hummed in the background, and a neighbor's dog barked a few yards away. When Jacob finally spoke, his voice hitched. "I've been thinking a lot about whether we can come back from this. Part of me wants to walk away, Mara. I feel so betrayed. But another part of me wants to fight for us, if you still want this marriage." Mara stared at her hands. Her ring gleamed mockingly. She thought of the nights in Dominic's arms, how alive she had felt, how creative and free. And then she looked at Jacob, saw the unwavering love that still lingered in his tearful eyes, the years they had built together. She still loved him. She realized in that moment that her desire for something more had never negated the bond she had with Jacob. She just hadn't been brave enough to speak up or ask for change in their marriage before crossing a line. "Yes," she whispered. "I want you. I'm so sorry for what I did. If there's a way, I want to try." Jacob closed his eyes. "Then we can see a counselor. We can talk. But you have to stop seeing Dominic entirely. No messages. No calls. Nothing. Mara nodded, tears streaming anew. She felt relief and fear swirling together. Could she truly let Dominic go? Could she resist the pull of a man she had already broken her vows for? But looking at Jacob's wounded face, the answer was obvious. She owed him that much, at the very least. When Mara finally called Dominic, her voice trembled, carrying the finality of the decision. She explained that Jacob wanted to work on the marriage, and that part of that process meant cutting off contact. Dominic listened quietly, the silence on his end cutting deeper than any words. After a moment he spoke, "I understand. I never wanted to hurt you or ruin your life. But I can't lie and say this doesn't break my heart." Mara closed her eyes. Images of their moments together flickered in her mind. She pressed her lips into a thin line, trying not to cry. "I'm sorry, Dominic," she managed. "I'm sorry for everything." He hesitated, as if wanting to plead with her. But when he spoke again, his voice was resigned. "Take care of yourself, Mara." The call ended, leaving her hollow and trembling. She stared at her phone, half expecting him to text or call back in a last attempt. But no messages arrived. The next day, at the magazine office, she submitted her resignation. She told her boss she needed time to handle a personal crisis. The boss seemed sympathetic, though perplexed. Mara left the building, heart pounding, uncertain of what the future held, only knowing that for now, she had to stay away from Dominic to even have a chance at repairing her marriage. Jacob and Mara began couples therapy. Week after week, they sat in a calm, neutral office with comfortable chairs and pastel walls, guided by a soft-spoken therapist named Dr. Rosenthal. Jacob talked about the pain of betrayal, about his fear that Mara would never truly love him again. Mara confessed her restlessness, her fear of never being understood. She broke down more times than she could count, confronted by how deeply she had hurt the very person she once vowed to cherish. Outside therapy, they implemented new routines. They dedicated time on weekends to do something new together, visiting art galleries, hiking in nature, taking cooking classes. They discussed traveling once they felt stable again, acknowledging that perhaps a change of scenery would help Mara find the spark of life she had sought outside the marriage. Jacob grew more introspective, recognizing that he had sometimes neglected the emotional spontaneity Mara craved. Mara realized she needed to speak up about her dissatisfaction rather than hiding it. Still, the wound was fresh. At night, when Jacob touched her, she sometimes sensed a hesitation, as though he was replaying images in his mind, wondering if she was thinking of Dominic. She learned to hold him, whisper apologies and reassurances. The road was far from smooth. They argued, they cried, they made up. There were days Jacob would leave the house angrily, returning hours later with red-rimmed eyes, only to tell her quietly that he wanted to keep trying. Mara didn't contact Dominic, though there were lonely evenings when she ached with the temptation to do so. She forced herself to remember Jacob's face, the sincerity in his gaze, and the therapist's words about honesty and accountability. Gradually, they found a tentative new normal. Jacob left post-it notes for Mara with small affirmations. "I appreciate you. Thank you for last night. You mean so much to me." Mara started a journal, writing short stories again for the first time in years, tales of longing, regret, and hope. She showed them to Jacob, who, although not a literary expert, read them with genuine interest. They communicated in ways they never had before, sharing their fears and dreams. As the seasons changed, so did their relationship. They faced the hidden cracks in their marriage, the ones that had been there long before Dominic appeared. Mara felt guilty that it took such a devastating breach of trust for them to address the void. But if there was a silver lining to the pain, it was that they began to truly see each other beyond the comfortable roles they had fallen into. Nearly 7 months after Mara ended her affair, she went grocery shopping in a neighboring district. Jacob was out of town at a math conference, and she had decided to try a new Italian recipe that weekend. Pushing her cart through the produce aisle, she found herself face to face with Dominic. He looked thinner, maybe a little older. The crow's feet at the corner of his eyes seemed more pronounced. His expression shifted from surprise to a flicker of sorrow to a gentle smile. Mara's heart raced in her chest. "Hi," he said quietly, hands gripping his cart. "Long time." She swallowed. "Hi." They stood in awkward silence, surrounded by the neon lights and the swirl of other shoppers. Part of Mara wanted to flee, to avoid reopening old wounds. Another part of her felt the old pull, remembering how he used to look at her like she was something precious. "How are you?" Dominic asked eventually. Mara nodded slowly. "I've been working on myself, on my marriage." She glanced down, avoiding his gaze. "It's been hard, but we're trying." A mix of emotions flickered across his face. Relief, sadness, acceptance. "That's good. I'm glad you two are trying. You deserve to be happy, Mara." He paused, running a hand through his hair. "I found a new job at a different publisher, and I'm writing more now, focusing on my own stories." "That's great," Mara said, genuine pride creeping into her voice. "You're talented. You should keep writing." They lingered a moment longer. Neither mentioned the nights they had spent together, the betrayals, the heartbreak. It was all there, unspoken, overshadowing the bright produced displays. After a respectful pause, Dominic offered a small goodbye. "Take care," he whispered, voice trembling. "You look good." Mara managed a small nod, a faint, sad smile. "You too." She watched him walk away, feeling a strange mixture of relief and longing. It struck her that this was closure in its rawest form. Two people who had once risked everything for each other, now little more than ghosts of a past mistake. She took a shaky breath and continued shopping. Though part of her felt an ache, she also recognized that she had made her choice months ago. There was no going back. On the drive home, Mara reflected on her journey since the affair. She still wasn't entirely free from guilt or regret, but she was learning to be kind to herself, to forgive without forgetting the lessons. She and Jacob were in a more honest place, though they had a long way to go. The cracks in their marriage might never fully disappear, but they were forging new memories, layering them with trust earned day by day. That evening, she prepared a hearty Italian meal, lasagna from scratch. Jacob wasn't due back from his conference until the following night, so she wrapped the leftovers carefully for him. She left a handwritten note on the table. "I missed you this weekend. There's lasagna in the fridge. It's a new recipe. I think you'll love it. Mara." She placed a small heart beside her name, something she hadn't done in years. Then she stood there, surveying the house. The sun had set, leaving a pool of warm light in the kitchen. She recalled how not too long ago, this place had felt suffocating. But now, in the wake of everything that had happened, it felt real, more fragile, but also more alive. She sat down at the table and opened her notebook, scribbling the beginnings of a new story. This one was about a married couple who rediscovered each other after nearly losing everything. She wrote until her hand cramped, until the leftover aroma of fresh tomato sauce filled the kitchen. She paused to sip some water and reread her words. A part of her wondered what Dominic was doing at that very moment, whether he was drafting another novel or perhaps sharing a meal with someone new. A pang of melancholy touched her, but she knew that some chapters in life closed for good reason. Jacob arrived home late the next day, exhausted from the conference. Mara welcomed him with a tender kiss, helped him carry his bags inside. He warmed up the lasagna, took a bite, and hummed in approval. "This is amazing," he said with a smile, leaning over to give her a quick peck on the cheek. Then he noticed her notebook on the counter. "Been writing again?" Mara nodded. She felt a flutter of pride mixed with vulnerability. "Yes, just some short stories. But I'm serious about it now." He set down his fork. "I'm really happy for you. Maybe we can read them together later." She felt her heart swell with gratitude. It was in these small gestures, his genuine curiosity, her willingness to share, that they were mending the fractures in their bond. They weren't naive. They knew the road to full healing was long. But as they ate together in comfortable silence, Mara sensed that, for the first time in a long time, they were building something new, something that acknowledged the mistakes of the past without letting them define the future. In the days and months that followed, they continued therapy. They continued honest conversations. Sometimes, a wave of doubt or jealousy would wash over Jacob, triggered by memories he couldn't erase. Mara would steady him, reaffirm her commitment. Other times, Mara herself would be racked by guilt, wondering if she deserved a second chance. Jacob would hold her hand and say that they had chosen to keep going, to love each other in spite of everything. Neither pretended it was simple. And so life went on, no longer the neat, predictable pattern it once was. Their marriage, once built on a comforting but sometimes stifling routine, now had a rawness and a realness. They planned a trip to Italy the following year, a place Mara had always dreamed of visiting, one that Dominic's stories had once awakened in her imagination. She and Jacob agreed they should take that adventure together. Maybe they'd stand on a balcony overlooking the Mediterranean, breathing in the salty air, forging a new memory that belonged solely to them. On a breezy afternoon, nearly a year after the affair ended, Mara found herself in the yard, trimming the rose bushes she had neglected for too long. The sun warmed her shoulders as she snipped away dead twigs, letting the fresh buds breathe. A symbol, she thought, of cutting away the withered parts of life to allow growth to flourish. She heard Jacob's footsteps crunch on the gravel path behind her. Turning, she saw him approach with 2 plane tickets in hand, a grin lighting up his face. "They're non-refundable, so we're committed," he joked, holding them out. Mara laughed, setting down the gardening shears. She wiped her hands on her jeans, then took the tickets, reading the destination, Rome. She felt a surge of excitement, coupled with a twinge of nerves. This trip was a promise to each other, a step into unknown territory after so much heartbreak. Jacob slipped an arm around her waist. "Thank you for giving us another chance," he whispered. She met his gaze, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you for fighting for us, for not giving up on me." They stood there under the afternoon sun, the scent of roses and grass filling the air. In that moment, no words were needed. The weight of the past remained, but so did the promise of a tomorrow shaped by honesty and renewed devotion. Because, at the heart of it all, they had chosen each other again. And for now, that was enough.